Minister, distinguished guests, dear friends and colleagues, and certainly last but not least, dear students. It's a great honor and personal pleasure also for me to welcome the First Minister of Scotland here to the college. Scotland has been a great supporter of the college over the years. We have benefited for a number of years of scholarships in the Scottish government, which have even survived the cuts which have been made to the scholarships by the UK government. This is a small remark. Scotland has contributed very much to Europe over the centuries in intellectual terms. We just spoke about Adam Smith, for instance. Scotland has also been a supporter of the European integration process, and Scotland is approaching a very important decision in September of this year. So we are very pleased, and say it again, very much honored that you have chosen to come to the college to give a message about Scotland and the European Union, its economic and political dimension. I would also like to add, we at the College of Europe, we hope to provide our students with skills which they might use in the future to become leaders in their respective fields. In the political field, in the economic sphere, in the sphere of the law. If I may say so, I think you can teach our students a few lessons in terms of leadership, because leadership, takes courage, takes vision and great determination. Of course, the college is neutral on the question whether or not Scotland should become an independent country, but this will not prevent us from expressing our recognition for your outstanding leadership skills, if I may say so. And our students might take a few lessons from you in terms of vision, determination, and political courage. I would also like to add that you are certainly no stranger to academic environments, not only that you studied in St Andrews, but you have also served as a professor at the University of Strathclyde. This is, of course, an academic environment, so we appreciate also your background in this respect. I would not like to steal more time from you, because your message is the important thing today. I will also not reveal that I got an advance copy of your speech, so I will not elaborate on the content. That would not be fair. First Minister, the floor is all yours. We're looking forward.
It's a great pleasure to speak here today to this audience in Bruges, and to those watching, of course, in the college campus in Natalin in Poland. I have to say, when you sing all these nice things about the rector, I was sitting there nodding, agreeing with every single word that you said, and particularly about the scholarships, of course. I should confess that a couple of years ago, when we made the very wise decision as the Scottish Government to continue with our scholarship, say here at the College of Europe, I did actually realise that in a couple of years' time I'd be coming to make this speech. So it was all based on the self-interest of knowing that I'd be making this address. But anyway, it is a tangible indication, perhaps, of a different attitude that prevails in Scotland on the one hand and Westminster on the other towards the College of Europe. But this, of course, was the first university to offer postgraduate studies and training in European affairs. It continues to be one of the best places anywhere in the world to study the subject, which is why, of course, the Scottish Government funds a scholarship for outstanding students from Scotland. Now, Bruges, of course, is a city which has very, very close links with Scotland for centuries. As one of the great commercial centres of Europe in the Middle Ages, Bruges was at times the staple or the entry port, the monopoly port for commerce between Scotland and the continent. In fact, a community of Scottish merchants settled here more than 700 years ago. and of course merchants from Bruges were settled in Scotland, in the port of Berwick. Now in England, but then the second biggest port in Scotland. Now there's an interesting story which we might like to reflect on about human affairs and human attitudes. In 1296, the Edward Plantagenet, the most powerful king in Western Christendom, invaded Scotland and sacked the town of Berwick. The Scottish garrison held out bravely for a few days. The Bruges merchants in the citadel held out for weeks, actually months. And the moral of the story is, of course, if you're defending your country, you hold out for a few days. If you're defending your trading concessions, then you really hold out as long as possible. But that connection, that trading connection, stretching over these 700 years, is just one indication of the way in which Scotland's prosperity over the centuries has been bound up with the ability to trade, to travel, to work across Europe. And just as Scots have always worked and lived in Europe, so there are now 160,000 people from other European Union states who have chosen to live and work in Scotland. And they make a massive contribution to Scotland's economy and Scotland's culture. Now these European connections are what we are. They are an essential part of who we are. Scotland has always been a nation that looks outwards to Wales, England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, to the other nations of Europe, and indeed right across this planet. And we're comfortable with the idea of overlapping identities. We know you can be Scottish and British, Scottish and European, Scottish and Polish, Scottish and Pakistani. Tartan is the distinctive national cloth of Scotland. Tartan is made up of patterned threads of different colours. And I like to think that the Scottish identity is like the tartan. There are many colours, many threads, many strands to the Scottish tartan of identity. Now, I emphasise that point for two reasons. Firstly, because it's fundamental to the main message of this speech today, that an independent Scotland would be an enthusiastic, engaged and committed contributor to the European progress. But it's also fundamental to understanding the nature of the campaign for Scottish independence. Ours is a peaceful, inclusive, civic, and above all a democratic and constitutional independence movement. It has been cited as such internationally, and there's sharp contrast to the often anti-democratic processes we see elsewhere. And our vision for the nation includes and welcomes those, all of those, who wish to call Scotland their home. And interestingly enough, this inclusiveness extends to our elections. Scotland is one of the few places in the European Union to allow other EU nationals to vote in our national parliament elections. They will also have a vote in the referendum on Scottish independence on the 18th September. So all 160,000 have a vote in the upcoming referendum. That tradition is long-standing in Scottish politics. Before the European Union was established, citizens of the Irish Republic were allowed to vote. And indeed, they and citizens of other Commonwealth countries still have the right to vote. And that civic nationalism promotes internationalism. Our independence movement embraces interdependence. We seek sovereignty, knowing that we shall then choose to share that sovereignty. In many ways, in fact, Scottish independence is a cause which has been profoundly influenced and strengthened by the European Union itself, an institution which enables countries of all sizes to contribute as equal partners, and which is an enduring rebuke to any notion that independence means isolation. And our referendum process is founded on consensus. It was agreed with the United Kingdom government, confirmed by the Edinburgh Agreement I signed with the Prime Minister David Cameron some 18 months ago. And one of the many reasons why the outgoing President of the European Commission prompted surprise, even in some quarters ridicule, from so many people across Europe when he recently compared Scotland to Kosovo, is he erroneously confused our consented constitutional process with what was a contested unilateral declaration of independence. The background circumstances, of course, between the two cases are also completely different. The case for independence rests on a simple but overwhelming truth, and that is that the best people to take many decisions about the future of Scotland are the people who live and work in Scotland. That applies to domestic policy, how we create a fairer, more prosperous country, and it also applies to international policy, how useful Scotland can be to the world, including the decisions about what sovereignty we pool with others. But at the present moment, our ability to take those decisions is heavily constrained by our constitutional position. As part of a state where Scottish members make up less than 10% of the total in the Westminster Parliament, the leading party in the United Kingdom government has but one seat out of 59 constituencies at Westminster from Scotland. In fact, for more than half of my life, Scotland has been governed by parties from Westminster which didn't command a political majority in Scotland. Now that's a profound democratic deficit. It affects all areas of Scottish life, and because of the rising influence of a virulent strain not just of Euroscepticism but of Europhobia at Westminster, it now poses a real threat to Scotland's place in Europe. Now, the College of Europe, of course, invited Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in October 1988 to speak about the United Kingdom's place in Europe. Her speech is known in Britain as the Bruges speech. At that time, it was seen as a rebuke to proposals being put forward by the European Commission on social policy. It is actually a mark of how much the debate has moved that Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, it seems almost commonplace now, and not the radical departure that it seemed at the time. But there is no doubt whatsoever, it helped inspire and empower a strain of Euroscepticism, which has had an enduring and damaging influence over United Kingdom government policy ever since. The Conservative Party on Europe started to fracture almost immediately after the Bruges speech, and remains, of course, divided to this day. In 1989, a Bruges group of Europhobes and Eurosceptics was established in the UK, which quickly gained considerable leverage within the Conservative Party. More recently, UKIP has become a serious political force in England, again exercising a substantial degree of influence over Westminster politicians. Now, the consequences of these developments are becoming very clear. Every single one of the 4 Prime Ministers since Margaret Thatcher has pledged to put Britain at the heart of Europe, each of them using exactly the same phrase. Yet the reality has been very different. Today Britain sits at the margins of European influence, and if Scotland remains governed from London, we face the prospect of an in-out referendum on whether to be part of the European Union at all. Interestingly enough, it's actually unlikely that Margaret Thatcher, certainly not as Prime Minister, would ever have endorsed such a course of action. She questioned how Europe worked, not whether to be in Europe full stop. But David Cameron's proposal is to hold such a referendum in 2017. Now, it's a position which no politician in Scotland would ever have considered to be reasonable. There is virtually no support for this step within the Scottish Parliament, for example. Now, in these circumstances, people in Scotland would almost certainly vote to stay in the European Union, but the result for the UK as a whole is much more doubtful. A YouGov poll last week, for example, found that in Scotland voters supported staying in the European Union by 2 to 1. Elsewhere in the UK, the split was 50-50. And so because Scotland makes up just 8% of the UK population, it is conceivable that unless we choose to change our constitutional circumstances this coming September, we could be dragged out of the European Union against our will. Therefore, in my submission, the real risk to Scotland's place in Europe is not the independence referendum this September, it's the potential in-out referendum of 2017. The decision-making on Europe is not the primary reason for seeking Scottish independence. The main reason for seeking independence is a desire to gain the powers any normal nation has, the powers you need to build a fairer and more prosperous country. But the contrast that we now see between playing a full and equal role in Europe as an independent state or potentially leaving it against our will is an important additional factor in the constitutional debate in Scotland. It highlights a fundamental truth that the best way to make a positive contribution is as an independent and equal partner in the family of nations. Now, the Scottish Government recognises that continued membership of the European Union requires negotiations on specific terms. That is only right and proper. But these negotiations, in our submission, should be completed within the 18-month period between a yes vote in September and achieving independence in March 2016. You don't have to depend on the Scottish Government for that opinion. I can cite Professor James Crawford, the United Kingdom Government's own chosen legal expert on such matters. And the professor told the BBC's Today programme that an 18-month timetable is, quote, realistic. And that was on the same day that his report for the UK Government was published. So David Edward, of course, is the former judge of the European Court of Justice, one of the true architects of the European Union. It is Sir David who has said that during the 18 months between the Scottish yes vote and independence, there is, quote, an obligation, a legal obligation, to negotiate a solution that does not lead to the absurd result that is being suggested, that is, of Scotland being required to leave the European Union only to immediately reapply for membership. So there need be no reopening of the European Union budget as agreed last year to 2020. Scotland would take responsibility for its share of UK contributions and UK receipts, which means that we would still be a net contributor to the Union. We would remain within the common travel area of the British Isles, which we are at present, and as a senior UK Government Minister acknowledged to the Guardian newspaper just a few weeks ago, of course, we will continue to share a currency with the rest of the UK. So we propose a practical, common sense approach to membership, which means that there is no detriment, none whatsoever, to any other member of the European Union as a result of Scotland's continuing membership. And the alternative hardly bears thinking about. The fishing fleets of 12 countries being denied any access to Scottish waters, and as a consequence their access to Norwegian waters, which is also dependent on the Scottish access from Norway. 160,000 EU workers and students, and of course voters, in Scotland suddenly uncertain about their status, 5.25 million people ceasing to be European citizens against their will. This alternative, as Sir David Edwards points out, is clearly absurd. But it's more than absurd. There is simply no legal basis in the European Union treaties for any such proposition. And furthermore, it would be against the founding principles of the Union itself. Now, the outgoing President of the Commission has defined European values as being freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and solidarity. There is no concept of solidarity which would cause Scotland to be refused inclusion in the European Union, following a free, democratic, and lawful process of self-determination. And that's why the European movement, the oldest pro-European campaigning group within the United Kingdom, last week described it as inconceivable that the European Union collectively would wish unilaterally to withdraw citizenship from 5.3 million of its citizens who have participated in the European project for 40 years. So let's just take it as read that everyone in this hall in Bruges is a committed European. Nobody will gainsay the agreed outcome of a peaceful and consensual referendum on independence. And let's therefore focus on the real issues. What Scotland can contribute, how useful we could be to the rest of the European Union. In our proposition, an independent Scotland would take its seat at the top table in the European Union alongside 28 other member states, 12 of which are the same size as Scotland or indeed smaller. In 1946, Winston Churchill made a famous speech in Zurich, which helped to inspire the early enthusiasm for European cooperation following the Second World War. He said that a stronger European partnership would make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honour by their contribution to the common cause. Now, recent years have done much to bear out this claim. The European Union has become an organisation where negotiation turns half tomato. where the strength of ideas can matter more than the size of population. Ireland's presidency of the Council last year was a major success. It concluded negotiations on the finances of Europe to 2020. 2 years ago, Denmark used its presidency of the Council to lead major and long overdue reforms to the common fisheries policy. Scotland worked closely with Denmark on that, on issues such as discard-free fisheries, the recovery of cod stocks and more regional level decision making. But we had no capacity to lead the development of reforms in the same way that Denmark could, nor to broker the final deal in the budget, as Ireland did. Scotland is one of the largest national shares of Europe's total fishing ground, 12 national fleets fish in our waters, yet we have less formal say in fisheries policies than landlocked countries such as Austria or Slovakia. Independence will change that. It allows Scotland to develop and pursue clear priorities such as energy and climate change, the environment, agriculture, fisheries, research, technology, digital technology and creative industries. And of course, when we share the same objectives as the rest of the United Kingdom, we will work with them. But where we don't, we'll no longer be bound in a position which could be harmful to our interests. We will set our own priorities, build our own alliances and put forward our own positive vision of Europe. Now, of course, in the evolved situation, we're already contributing. For example, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing in Scotland, Alex was in Brussels on Wednesday. The reason he's there is because of the role in our health and care services and the European Innovation Project in active and healthy ageing. We are leading the specific work on ICT-enabled integrated care. And that work addresses a fundamental question, which is across developed societies. How do we use technology to help provide care for older people at home and in the community? Protecting independence, quality of life, reducing healthcare costs, providing the best possible treatment where and when it's needed. As the proportion of older people in the population grows, it's a vital challenge facing Europe and indeed across the developed world. Or to take a second example, let's look at youth employment. Scotland was blighted by mass unemployment in the 1980s, so we have taken urgent action over the last 6 years to prevent that same criminal waste of human potential. We have the only youth employment minister in Europe. We have recently made Angela Constance Cabinet Secretary, but in common with other European countries, there is still much more to be done. Our Opportunities for All guarantee means that people aged between 16 and 19 have a guarantee of employment, training or education. We welcome adding our voice, our weight to other countries who have endorsed the European Youth Guarantee, but we can't, because the UK government disapproves of the idea of fully endorsing a more ambitious vision for young citizens. Well, let's look at the greatest challenge of all facing the planet, global warming. We have a key role to play in providing energy security for Europe, developing the low carbon technologies the world will need for the future. We know that it's not practical for all countries, of course, to achieve that, or in some cases even to come close to that. But we believe it's important, hugely important for the European Union to have these ambitious targets. Now, the United Kingdom government has only recently come down to supporting any targets for renewable energy, and its aims are still substantially less ambitious than those of the European Parliament. As an independent country, Scotland could be doing so much more to build coalitions, to set the terms of debate. As a devolved nation, we're still trying to persuade even the United Kingdom government. The new Commission takes office in November, and there has to be a hugely greater impetus for action on renewable energy. We need to support low carbon technologies so as they can reduce energy costs to grid effectively and at scale. We need to establish grid networks that span Europe to transport solar energy from the south and hydro, marine and offshore wind renewables from the north to meet the continent's need for secure and sustainable energy. This is no time for timidity in tackling climate change, and Scotland pledges to be an ambitious and constructive voice for progress, a sustainable, secure powerhouse of clean energy. In summary then, Scotland's vast natural resources and human talent make it one of the linchpins of the European Union's future. That key role in providing energy security for Europe. As one of the wealthiest countries, Scotland is a net contributor to the EU and will remain so as an independent member. We have more top universities per head than any other member of the European Union. Our academics collaborate with partners across Europe, including this institution. We have one of the largest national shares of Europe's total fishing ground. The EU fisheries policy would unravel without Scotland. Earlier this year, Viviane Reding, the Vice President of the Commission, described two great Scottish judges, Lord Mackenzie Stewart and Sir David Edward, as true architects of the European Union. But perhaps more than any of this, Scotland shares and promotes the values of solidarity, freedom and democracy at the heart of the European ideal. As such, an independent Scotland as an equal member state will bring a positive cooperative voice to the European Union, in contrast to the often sullen, disengaged voice that was spoken on our behalf since Margaret Thatcher's speech in this city more than a quarter of a century ago. And not being at the top table in Europe has harmed Scotland's interests now for 4 decades. Within the United Kingdom, we are occasionally consulted. With independence, we will contribute as equals. And in contributing as equals, we would make proposals to address the democratic challenges that Europe now faces. The financial and economic crisis in which the European Union has been trapped over the last 6 years has allowed radical Euroscepticism to secure a significant political foothold. We see this reflected in opinion polls in many parts of Europe, and we see it in the forthcoming elections for the European Parliament. If we are to restore public trust in the European Union's governance and its ability to materially improve people's lives, I believe we have to succeed on 3 fronts. First, we must prioritise economic policies that stimulate and promote sustainable economic growth, and have in place social policies that ensure that everybody benefits from that growth. In the United Kingdom, we now have widening disparities in wealth which are corroding the fabric of society, causing deeply damaging inequalities in life expectancy, educational outcomes and employment prospects. In some areas of policy, it should be said honestly, that the European Union makes addressing these disparities more difficult than it needs to be. For example, the Scottish Government is committed to tackling low pay. We currently have no control over the UK's minimum wage, but we have pledged that an independent Scotland will increase at least in line with inflation every year. The United Kingdom minimum wage, currently £6.31 an hour in sterling, has declined in value in real terms over the last 6 years. The Scottish Government have introduced a living wage at £7.65 sterling an hour. In the public sector, it applies across Scotland. A living wage gives individuals, families enough income to meaningfully participate in society rather than merely afford the most basic necessities. The European Union law prevents both us and Scottish local authorities from making that living wage a requirement in public sector contracts. What made Margaret Thatcher's speech of 25 years ago so out of kilter back then was that Europe commanded strong popular support in its moves towards a social Europe that Lady Thatcher was trying to resist. It was in stark contrast to the free market ideology of the 1980s. In Scotland, for example, Europe's approach was far more in tune with the prevailing social democratic ethos and the policies imposed by Margaret Thatcher's government of that day. And so people across the continent who want to see Europe rebalancing the economy and addressing inequality will ask themselves why we are in a position now where European Union law prevents us from increasing the living standards of European Union workers. I'll be asking the Commission that question later today. Perhaps they'll have an explanation. Certainly they should have a rethink. Second contribution, we have to restore public confidence in the democratic credentials of the legislative and policy-making process in Brussels. I take the view that this can be achieved by improving the quality and sensitivity of European Union governance rather than through yet another round of treaty reform. The levers of subsidiarity and above all proportionality were included in the treaties to protect citizens against overburdensome and unnecessary rules and regulations. We have to make these levers work more successfully. And thirdly, we need a practical and compelling and visionary project. A project like the Marine Renewables Supergrid, a project that will give Europe a justification which transcends the commonplace and the transient. Now, these are not an exclusive list of contributions that Scotland would like to make in terms of thought and proposals for the development of the European Union. But they are issues of lasting significance, and Scotland pledges to play a constructive role in helping to address them. But there is a key difference between our approach to reform and that of the United Kingdom government. Scotland will make proposals about the type of Europe we want to be part of. The United Kingdom government is considering whether it wants to be part of Europe at all. Ladies and gentlemen, a 19th century UK Foreign Secretary, George Canning, said once, "I called the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old." He was talking about how events in South and Central America were changing the balance of power in Europe. Now there is a new world developing in Europe. It's a world where people want to be independent and interdependent, to address global and social challenges, to build a fairer and more prosperous society, to assess people in their nations by the contribution they make, the positive difference they make, rather than by their status or by their power. But unfortunately, too much of this debate on this new Europe at Westminster is distorted by dreams of an old empire. These dreams have little allure now for Scotland. Europe enriches our culture, our economy, our society. We cherish the freedom it gives us to share, to travel, to exchange. But we also seek the freedom to contribute our voice as an equal partner on the world stage, to contribute to the future success of the European project from which we gain so much, to contribute our talents and innovation to the challenges that Europe and the world face for the future. So when our small nation asks for freedom to contribute, we will meet a welcome from around Europe, and we will gladly make these contributions and more when an independent Scotland takes its place in the European family of nations. Thank you very much.
First Minister, I can't thank you enough for this very substantial perspective on Scotland's place in the European construction, on Scotland's future also. And I must say you have developed a very impressive list of contributions of Scotland to the European construction. And you have reminded us of quite a few of the fundamental values of this European construction. You have spoken about solidarity. You have spoken about the need to address questions of social policy, of employment policy, where clearly Europe also has a responsibility. And you have finally reminded us also that Scotland would claim sovereignty to share it in the context of the European construction, which is very much the message at the heart of the integration process. So thanks very much for this very concrete, very substantial statement on Scotland's position in the European construction. Whatever may be the outcome of the referendum, I cannot, so to say, obviously adopt a position, as I said before, but I think we can be sure that under your leadership, the attitude towards European construction is a positive one. You clearly want to engage to make progress on a number of dossiers. You have touched upon so many issues that you have very effectively contributed to our teaching program this year. For instance, we have a lot of interest of our students in a sustainable energy policy, and you elaborated on what Scotland's contribution could be. So thanks very much for this as well. First Minister, you have kindly agreed to take questions, and I would also like to say that our fellow students from the Natolin campus in Warsaw are also following your speech. If I could first invite our students here who have raised questions.
I have one question relating to what you said before, that you would wish to be part of the European Union in the case of independence. But I was wondering what makes you so sure that you would be part of the Union? Because I mean, I think that in the case of independence, probably countries like Spain or also maybe Belgium, for example, would probably not recognize, of course Britain, I forgot to mention them, the England, I mean, or the UK, they would probably not recognize Scotland as an independent country in the EU. So I was wondering, what do you expect in that sense? And also, if Scotland would not be granted EU membership again after independence, what would be your reaction to that? Thank you.
Third question, please.
Yes, thank you very much too for your speech. My question is about the attitude of the other countries. I have the impression you're expecting the other countries to just accept you. And you mentioned, for example, the budget, that it would be pretty easy to calculate a share in the budget of the UK you would have to pay, and that makes sense. I'm not sure how to calculate the share of Lady Ashton, for example. You cannot say, okay, 5% of Lady Ashton belongs to us now, or the number of seats in the parliament is not that easy. It's not an economic calculation that you can do for the budget. You cannot do for very important issues and sensible issues like the number of MEPs, the number of commissioners, etc. It always required long negotiations and big fights. Doesn't sound so easy to find an agreement on that issues as the budget. How would you do that? Thank you.
If I can take the questions in turn, the countries becoming independent is a fairly well-trod process. If I remember correctly, about 50 countries have become independent from Westminster since the Second World War. But strangely enough, you know, when I was an MP at Westminster for a quarter of a century, and I used to meet all the high commissioners from all of these countries, large and small, rich and poor. And interestingly enough, not one of them ever suggested they were going to come back under control of Westminster. Not a single one of any of these high commissioners over the years. So this is a pretty well-trod process in terms of division of assets. The geographical assets are very simple. I mean, the geographical assets are determined by where they are, obviously, both in terms on land and offshore. What is more interesting, of course, is intangible assets and assets held overseas. And the normal formula in this matter would be to divide them by population or by proportionate share. It is important for the UK government to understand, of course, that it is a share of assets and liabilities. If you take the position you're going to grab all the assets, then you end up with all the liabilities. And the liabilities, of course, the United Kingdom are very, very considerable. Perhaps £1.5 trillion of debt sterling by in a couple of years' time. So now we put forward in the white paper, we published last November, suggestions as to a formula by which we would accept a share of that liability. But of course, that is entirely dependent on having a share of the assets as well. But my view on these things is, once a decision is made, and the key to this decision making is the Edinburgh Agreement. 18 months ago, the Prime Minister and I signed an agreement by which this referendum is taking place. That agreement binds both governments, both the London Government and the Scottish Government, to abide by the majority outcome, and crucially, under Clause 30, to then act in the best interests of both Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, regardless of that outcome. And that Edinburgh Agreement, of course, is the pillar on which this consensual, democratic and agreed process takes place. Now, the lady who asked the question, you said about what the attitude of Spain might be. Let me read you the quotation from the Spanish Foreign Minister. If Britain's constitutional order allows, and it seems that it does allow, Scotland to choose independence, we have nothing to say about this. Because, of course, if you have an agreed consensual constitutional democratic process, which we have, then that is binding, not just on both governments on the Edinburgh Agreement, but it should be accepted by everyone else as well. It was why President Barroso was so mistaken about his comparison with Kosovo. Not the rights and wrongs of the Kosovan situation, but that was a unilateral declaration of independence. We are talking here about a consensual process, something that's been accepted by the partners within the current United Kingdom. And if it's acceptable to the partners within the current United Kingdom, then who else should be attempting to gainsay it? Now, this is something which is not unique in the world. I mean, it's something which is, has happened before, but it's rare and it's precious, and it's entirely democratic. And the point I made during my speech is it's not just this will be accepted by other Europeans. This is essential to the constitutional and democratic integrity of this union that it's accepted. It cannot not be accepted without doing fatal damage to the European ideal. So I mentioned all of the enormous things that Scotland has to contribute to this Europe. With 1% of the population, 60% of the oil reserves, 25% in European Union's renewable offshore potential, 20% of the fish stocks of this union. But ultimately, Scotland's place is not dependent on these massive natural resources, important in practical terms, though they undoubtedly are. Scotland's position is dependent on the democratic principles on which this union was based, and if this union doesn't follow democratic principles on which it's based, then it's lost, not lost to Euroscepticism, it's lost because it's betrayed its founding ideals. Now, thankfully and sensibly, President Barroso managed to flush out innumerable former Director Generals, Secretary Generals of the European Commission to say, no, the European Union must stay true to its democratic principles. Then lastly, the question was how you think the division of the monetary assets is more difficult than, for example, division of the seats in the European Parliament. I actually think there'll be more negotiation on the monetary bits. But the principles in terms of the Commissioner, the number of commissioners is one, the number of seats in the European Parliament will be identical to a country with the same population, Denmark, for example. It would be a good policy to follow. Now there's no advantage, no disadvantage, the same as other countries with an identical population. So the process by which it's been gone through in Scotland is civic, constitutional, inclusive, but above all democratic. We may have views on whether other countries elsewhere should also follow that process. No doubt perhaps they should. But what really matters is the respect to which that process is accorded now that it has been established.
First Minister, if you allow me, I got a question from our Natalie campus from Warsaw.
Sure.
First Minister, I read it out. Do you think that it's right that some countries forbid the promotion of separatism and the organization of referenda on self-determination? And the second question linked a bit, what would be an independent Scotland's position on breakaway regions in the European Union's neighbourhood, such as Kosovo, Northern Cyprus, Crimea, Transnistria and South Ossetia?
Well, it actually reads exactly into the comments I've just made. I could say to my friends again from Poland. I mean, yes, and I suspect many people in this hall would love each state to agree a consensual process as has been agreed within the United Kingdom. But then, of course, no two situations are exactly similar. They have different histories, different constitutionality. What actually matters in this, once that process has been agreed, then that process is respected not just by the parties to it, but by everyone else. Now, all of us would love a situation not just in this Europe, but in this world, where that was the route followed in terms of all political agreements and disagreements. And it may be, of course, that the Edinburgh Agreement may provide in the future as an example and as an exemplar of how to go about these things. But I found it best in conducting this argument to point out that Scotland is not identical to any other situation. I think the Edinburgh Agreement has principles within it which would be attractive, but I cannot dictate, nor should anyone try to dictate the internal constitutionality of another state or another area.
I want to ask you many questions about your vision for climate change and how you're going to rebalance the transition towards low carbon. But first you have to win an important election, in fact 2 important elections. So my question is around that. Do you foresee the European elections and the massive rise of Euroscepticism, particularly in the UK, being a help or a hindrance for the Scottish referendum later on?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Salmond. What I'd like to ask is more specifically related to Scotland. because it seemed from the polls that whichever way we vote on the 18th of September, that there's going to be a very substantial minority who didn't get what they want. And since you'll still be First Minister on the 19th, I'd like to know how you're going to set about healing the bridge between the two sides. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, leading on from the last question. I have a Scottish mother, an English father. I'm now British, working in the European Union, where I spend my entire time promoting the benefits of working together. Why is it, or would you say that a small union is bad and a big union is good?
Can I address the point from the gentleman from the NGO? As you're probably aware of the area you work in, that Scottish Parliament has statutory responsibility for climate change at the present moment. Which is really quite interesting, because we don't have statutory responsibility for the minimum wage, which I mentioned earlier, not actually to set public holidays in Scotland, but we have legislative responsibility for the biggest issue facing the planet. And you might wonder how this came about. Well, it came about because in 1997, after the devolution referendum, Donald Dewar was then the Secretary of State for Scotland and the First Minister of the new devolved Parliament. He devised the Scotland Act, and he came up with a stroke of genius, actually. He decided, instead of listing all of the things that were to be devolved, he would list the things that were to be reserved. And back in 1997, of course, climate change was not regarded at Westminster as being a huge issue. So it wasn't on the list of things that were to be reserved, and therefore it was devolved. So the Scottish Parliament ended up with legislative control over the biggest issue facing the planet. Now, that doesn't mean we can determine all of that, obviously, but nonetheless we passed the Climate Change Act. Significantly, the Parliament passed the Climate Change Act unanimously. Every single member in the Parliament voted for it, which I think is unique, actually, in terms of all parliaments which have looked at this type of legislation. And it passed one of the most ambitious climate change acts in the world, a 42% reduction from 1990 by 2020, and further targets which have since then been added. So the ambition was great, and to be fair, although we're not perfect and don't claim to be perfect, and we do some things better than we do other things, in terms of progress, particularly on renewables, progress has been spectacular. We're now at 45% of our electricity demand is provided by renewable generation. So there's been very substantial progress in some areas, somewhat less in other areas where we could do better, but by and large we are on target for our very ambitious targets. So I would hope that obviously countries have different resource bases as far as renewables is concerned. But nonetheless, I think there is something in our process that we managed to pass it by consensus, that every political force in the Parliament agreed to this support, and it carries a wide consensus across society, which might be useful for other countries in this, because clearly, as we know, and as we must realise, that unless we face this issue together, we'll get torn apart separately. The question from the gentleman for Scotland, there was a celebration service for Margaret MacDonald, which took place on Friday in Scotland. And Margaret MacDonald, for this audience, is one of the great rallying forces of Scottish independence over the last generation and more in Scottish politics. I mean, she burst onto the political scene by winning a by-election in 1973, and over that period, a whole variety of guys, she's been a great rallying figure for Scottish independence. And it was a hugely moving service, and one of the most moving aspects was her widower. Jim Sill was also previously a colleague of mine and a Westminster MP, gave Margot's last wish, as it were, in his eulogy, which was that she was calling on people to do exactly the point that you made, that to approach this referendum in such a way as the divisions which are inevitably caused in the democratic process will be healed. And that I undertake to do, and I commend that process, these words of Margot, to everyone else. I should say, however, that elections by their nature are strongly contested. The number of people now supporting independence in Scotland, according to the latest poll, is 48%, and the number of people opposing it is 52%. So it's a tight race at the present moment with five months to go. And I suspect, however the result goes, and I'm sure it will be a yes, but however the result goes, it will be a narrow majority. But the number of people in Scotland who say we should accept the majority, regardless of what it is not a narrow majority, it's a huge majority. The number of people who are prepared to accept the result on a referendum which has been organised in an impeccably constitutional way is massive. And therefore, I would argue that elections by definition and election campaigns can have an element of rough and tumble in them. But the electoral process is actually a healing process. That is the way you come to a decision. And the number of people prepared to back that decision, regardless of their view, is enormous. It's encapsulated in the Edinburgh Agreement, but more than that, encapsulated across society is the essential power of a referendum and a democratic decision in a civic society. But Margaret's words, incidentally, from that funeral service should be well heeded by all concerned.